Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that I think is so crucial when you're learning English, and that is listening.
It is.
You, our listener, flagged some really interesting insights from the B1 English Listening Practice podcast, Improve Your English Skills. So that's going to be the jumping off point for our deep dive today.
That's right. So whether you want to just improve your everyday conversations, get ready for the IELTS exam, or you just want to absorb information better in English, this is for you. You sent us this material because you know how important this is, and we're here to break it all down.
You know, it's funny, when I think about learning languages, most people, the first thing they think about is speaking, reading, writing.
Right.
Listening almost feels like the unsung hero. It's like the foundation.
It is.
But it doesn't always get the spotlight it deserves.
That's true. Listening is the bedrock of all those other skills. It's how you build this mental map of the English language.
Mm-hmm.
Every time you listen, you're kind of internalizing vocabulary, how sentences are structured, the grammar, the pronunciation, the rhythm.
Okay, so let's break down that mental map idea a little bit more.
Sure.
Because it's not just about passively hearing words, is it?
No.
It's about how all those pieces connect together and actually make sense in real-world context.
Right. It's the bridge,
Right.
It's the bridge that connects all the different parts of your English. You can't speak naturally, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you don't understand how native speakers actually use the language,
Right.
if you miss things in conversation, your responses are going to be off.
Yeah.
You might even misunderstand people. So listening is that real world,
Yeah.
exposure.
It is. It's like, you're talking about the faster pace of real speech.
Yes.
The little expressions, the things you don't necessarily get in a textbook.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. It's like knowing the difference between what's up
Right.
and how are you,
Yeah.
know?
Exactly.
And then, I'm good, thanks. It's
Yeah.
the appropriate response to what's up.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just those simple greetings.
Right.
It's about all those subtle the fillers in a conversation.
Yes.
The change in tone. It's the natural, give and take of how people really speak.
Right. That's where you pick up colloquialisms and idioms,
So.
things that they don't actually teach you. It's like the unspoken rules.
Unspoken rules, yeah.
Yeah.
And here's a really interesting point. And this is something that I think is, we're talking about English as if it's one thing. But we all know, everyone knows that English is spoken all over the world, and it doesn't sound the same everywhere.
No.
We're talking about accents,
Yeah.
right? American, British, Australian, they can sound incredibly different.
And this is where, listening to those different accents trains your ear,
Yeah.
To pick up those variations. It's not just about understanding one type of English.
Yeah.
If you plan on traveling, if you plan on studying abroad, if you're taking the IELTS,
Right.
you're going to hear all these different accents.
Yeah.
The IELTS listening section has them.
Right.
So getting used to them now is a huge advantage.
Right, because it's kind of like your brain is like a soundboard.
Yes.
And the more sounds you expose it to,
Yeah.
the more adaptable and effective it becomes at processing all those different phonetics.
Exactly.
It's like tuning an instrument, isn't it? To
Yeah.
all these different frequencies. The more varied your sounds, the better you become at actually picking out the melody,
Yes.
even when there are all these different instruments playing.
Yes. And it's not just about the words, it's about tone. Are they being sarcastic?
Right.
Are they joking? Are
Mhm.
they serious? Are they being empathetic?
Right.
These are things that go beyond, the literal meaning of the words.
So listening isn't just passive intake.
No.
It actually helps you to be more expressive yourself.
Of course. Of course. Listening affects your speaking.
Right.
You start to understand the natural rhythms of conversations.
Yeah.
The intonation, the pauses.
Right.
This all makes you a more fluent speaker, a better pronunciation.
Right.
A more natural rhythm when you speak.
Right.
And it's good for your confidence.
It is.
You're mirroring how native speakers actually talk.
It is. And I imagine it bleeds over into writing as well.
Yeah.
If you hear these natural sentence structures
Yeah.
and you're hearing this expanded vocabulary,
Yeah.
That's got to help your own writing.
Like, absolutely. You become familiar with collocations.
Right.
Words that naturally go together.
Right.
Like make a mistake.
Right.
As opposed to do a mistake, for example.
Right, exactly.
Idioms as well. You start to sound more natural.
Yeah.
More polished.
Right.
Less like you're translating from another language. You're not just relying on those grammar rules.
Right.
You're really drawing on this understanding you've built up through listening.
And for anyone facing exams like the IELTS, it sounds like listening is not just one part of it. It's central to doing well.
Oh, yeah. It's fundamental to success.
Yeah.
The IELTS listening section is testing you on your ability to pick out specific details.
Okay.
Figure out meaning from context, follow instructions.
Right.
Good listening is key.
Yeah.
Whether it's a conversation, a lecture, whatever.
Right.
How well you understand really impacts your score.
It all feeds back, doesn't it? It's kind of surprising to me, the effect that it has even on things like how you learn vocabulary and even reading comprehension.
Oh, yeah.
Because hearing these words used naturally,
right,
it just gives you this deeper, more intuitive grasp of what they mean.
Yeah. Yeah, it gives you that context.
Right.
It's richer than reading alone.
Right.
When you hear the word used in a sentence and
Yeah.
you understand the situation, it sticks.
Right. Exactly.
More than just looking it up in a dictionary.
It does. So to sum it up, listening is not just about using your ears.
Right.
It's about using your brain.
Yes.
Actively understanding what's being said, the tone, the context.
Yes.
And that elevates your ability to communicate in English and gives you confidence.
Exactly. It's not passive. It's not about sounds entering your ears. It's a cognitive process of comprehension.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you're prepping for a test, if you're traveling,
Yeah.
if you just want to improve your everyday English.
Yeah.
It's vital.
Okay, so we've really hit on the why.
Yes.
Why is it so important?
Yeah.
So let's shift gears now and talk about, specifically for our B1 level learners, how can they work to improve these skills?
Mm-hmm.
The source material you shared has some great practical strategies.
It does. At B1, you're kind of moving beyond those basics.
Right.
It's about being able to engage more actively with this, more complex spoken English.
Right.
So these strategies are going to equip you to follow conversations more easily, to understand different accents,
Right.
and to feel more prepared for, tests like IELTS.
Okay, great. So the first one on the list is to focus on getting the main idea. And this seems so crucial, especially when you might not understand every single word.
It is. It's huge, especially if you're in a fast-paced environment, like an IELTS exam or just a normal conversation, right?
Right.
Getting the gist is so important.
Right.
You don't need to understand every word.
Right.
It's easy to get hung up, but by focusing on the main point, you can actually follow along.
Okay.
You can respond appropriately.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you can answer those questions.
So even on the IELTS test, if you miss a word or two, understanding the main idea will help you to answer correctly.
Absolutely. The IELTS questions tend to relate to the main point anyway.
Okay.
So getting the main idea increases your chances of being right, even if some details are fuzzy.
Go ahead.
This also helps you to stay calm.
Okay.
During the test.
Okay.
Because you know that you're still getting that information.
Okay. Okay.
When you're practicing, with podcasts or lectures, just try to identify the main theme early on.
Okay.
Don't get too hung up on words you don't know.
Don't get hung up on the words, okay? Number 2 is all about using context clues.
Yes.
So this feels a bit like, being a detective. You got to piece together meaning from the clues around it.
It is. It is. At B1, new words are normal.
Right.
It's part of it.
Yeah.
But you don't need to understand everything to get the message.
Oh.
These context clues, the words around the unknown word, the speaker's tone, they all help you to understand.
Okay. So give us an example of how this works in action.
Okay. So let's say you hear someone say eco-friendly.
Okay.
And you're not sure what it means.
Yeah.
But then they start talking about recycling and protecting the environment.
Right.
You can guess that eco-friendly probably has something to do with the environment.
Right.
This is huge for IELTS.
Okay.
You might hear an unfamiliar word, but by thinking about the context,
Right.
you can still answer the question.
Okay.
The key is to focus on what you do understand and use that to make a guess.
Okay.
And then keep moving.
Keep moving. Okay. Don't get stuck.
Don't get stuck.
All right. Number 3 is all about practicing listening for specific information.
Right.
So this is kind of honing your ability to actually pull out key details from what you hear.
Yeah, it's about training yourself to look for specific things.
Okay.
Dates, names, numbers, places, facts.
Okay.
And this is good for those detail questions in IELTS, So instead of just listening generally,
Right.
You're listening with a purpose.
Right.
So, for example, you could listen to a news report
Okay.
and focus on writing down the time something happened
Okay.
or the names of the people,
Okay. Okay.
This trains you to be more attentive, more focused.
Okay.
You can filter out the stuff that doesn't matter and really concentrate on the important information.
Right.
This is going to improve your speed and comprehension.
So it's all about training yourself to pick out those key details.
Yes.
And to really listen for those.
Yes.
All right. The next one, number 4, is one that many learners find so challenging, but also so important. And that is listening to different English accents.
Yeah.
It can be such a hurdle if you're only used to one.
Yeah. It is. English is so global.
It is.
Yeah. And the accents can be so different.
They are.
Just think about British and American English. The pronunciation, the words they use, the spelling even.
It's all different.
Yeah. So at B1, it's really important to start listening to all these different accents.
So it's not enough to just get comfortable with one particular way of speaking English.
Right.
You got to branch out. You got
to broaden your horizons.
Yeah, broaden your horizons,
Yeah.
broaden your audio stream.
Right. So make the effort to listen to people from the UK, the US, Australia, Canada.
Okay.
All those different places. Podcasts and videos online are really good for this.
Okay.
This helps your ear adjust to different speech patterns.
Right.
Different vocabulary, different ways of pronouncing things.
Okay.
And remember, the IELTS listening test has different accents.
Right.
So the more familiar you are, the more confident you'll feel.
So practice makes perfect when it comes to this kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right. Number 5 is one that we hear about a lot in the context of learning.
Yeah.
And that's repeat and review.
Yeah.
And it seems particularly effective for listening.
Oh, for sure. Listening to the same thing multiple times is really powerful.
Okay.
So the first time, just focus on getting the general idea.
Okay.
Don't worry too much about individual words.
Okay.
But then, on later listens, you can start to focus on the details.
Right.
Really understand what's being said.
So it's like the first listen is seeing the forest for the trees, and then the later listens, you're examining each tree.
Exactly. You could listen to a podcast once just to get the topic.
Right.
And then a second time, taking notes, maybe trying to summarize the key points.
Okay.
If there's a section that's tricky,
Right.
just listen to it again and again until you get it.
Okay.
And this really solidifies the understanding.
Right.
And then, it helps you to recognize those patterns when you hear something new.
Right. It does.
Yeah.
Okay. Number 6 is all about engaging with different types of audio content. So it's not just about the spice of life. It's about actually improving your listening.
Right. Oh, yeah. Don't just stick to one thing.
Right.
Try different things. Podcasts, interviews, radio, audiobooks, news.
Okay.
This exposes you to different speaking styles, different speeds, different levels of clarity.
Right.
Someone reading the news might sound very different from someone chatting in an interview.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So, by practicing with different types of content, you become better prepared.
Right.
You're ready for those unexpected speeds and accents.
Yeah.
Especially in things like IELTS. Like interviews are good for understanding multiple speakers.
Right.
Audiobooks help you to follow these longer, more formal speeches.
Right.
So the more variety you have,
Right.
the better.
The better.
Yeah.
The better prepared you'll be.
Okay, so these are all really great actionable strategies.
Yes.
Now, the material you shared also points to some really fantastic resources. It does.
So let's dig into some of those recommended resources.
Sure. You know, the right tools can make a huge difference.
They can.
You know, at D1, there's just so much out there to help you improve.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start by talking about podcasts.
Okay.
I mean, they're so accessible these days.
They are.
What would you recommend for our listeners?
Podcasts are amazing. You know, they're flexible. You can listen on the go.
Right.
There's so many topics.
There are.
So for B1, BBC Learning English is great.
Okay.
You know, the English We Speak podcast is really good. It has these short, clear explanations of everyday phrases.
Okay.
They break down what they mean and they give you examples.
So that's great for those casual expressions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then they have the main BBC Learning English podcast.
Okay.
And that one is slower. It's well structured.
Okay.
You know, topics like culture, grammar, vocabulary, practical English.
Okay.
Really comprehensive.
Mhm.
And then there's 6-Minute English, also from the BBC. And these are 6-minute episodes on all sorts of interesting topics.
Okay.
Current events, stories. The pace is good for B1.
6 minutes? That's very doable, even for a busy schedule.
It is.
So podcasts in general, they give you that natural rhythm, that
Yeah.
pronunciation,
Yeah.
that intonation,
Right.
and they expose you to those different accents, those different topics,
Yes.
those different styles of speaking.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so let's move on to YouTube channels.
Okay.
I mean, YouTube has become such a powerhouse.
Yeah.
But it's also packed with really good stuff for language learners.
It is.
What are some of your top picks?
Okay, so English from A to Z,
Okay.
which is, you know, the source material for this episode, has a
Right.
great channel.
Okay.
Their videos are made for B1.
Okay.
They focus on both listening and speaking.
Okay.
They cover everyday expressions, vocabulary, pronunciation, practical English,
Right.
you know, stuff you can use.
Okay.
And then there's, you know, IELTS Liz. She's great. She gives you lots of specific practice and tips,
Okay.
you know, for the listening part of the IELTS.
Yeah.
Sample questions, explanations, techniques to help you understand better.
Okay.
And she also covers other parts of the test.
Right.
So it's a really good resource if you're prepping for that.
So you've got those structured lessons and exercises,
Yeah.
but then you've also got things like interviews and short debates and tutorials.
Mhm.
So you're exposed to different contexts,
Yeah.
different voices.
Yeah.
It helps you to get used to different speeds and vocabulary.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about audiobooks.
Okay.
They offer a different kind of listening experience,
Yeah.
but they can be really immersive.
They are.
I love audiobooks.
Yeah. They're great. You know, you can practice listening for longer while you enjoy a story.
Right.
For B1, I'd recommend starting with simplified versions of popular novels.
Okay.
They use simpler words and sentences.
Okay.
And there's also audiobooks that are specifically designed for learners,
Okay.
you know, focusing on grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation.
Yeah. Right.
You know,
Yeah.
the big thing here is that you get used to a natural pace.
Right.
You hear the proper pronunciation,
Yep.
you know, the intonation.
Right.
You can listen as many times as you want.
Right.
You can rewind, which is great.
Yeah.
So it really helps with fluency and it builds your vocabulary.
It does. Okay, let's move on to news websites and apps.
Okay.
This feels like a good way to tackle more complex language
Yes.
and more formal vocabulary.
It is. It is. Listening to the news exposes you to more complex grammar,
Okay.
more formal vocabulary.
Yeah.
You know, BBC News, CNN, they have tons of audio content,
Right.
news reports, podcasts, clips. You're hearing native speakers talking about current events.
Right.
So it's really good for your understanding and your listening skills.
So you stay up to date on what's going on in the world,
Yeah.
but you're also improving your English.
Yeah.
It's a win-win.
It is.
And a lot of these places also have transcripts,
Yeah.
so you can read along as well.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right, last but not least, let's touch on language exchange apps.
Okay.
This is where you get to actually interact with real people.
Yeah. So apps like Tandem and HelloTalk are great.
Okay.
They connect you with native speakers who want to learn your language. So you help each other.
Right.
You practice listening through voice messages,
Okay.
calls. It's really interactive.
Right.
So it's not just passive listening. It's back and forth.
Right. It's a real conversation.
Yeah, exactly. You get to hear all these natural conversational English from all different accents.
Okay, so that's really cool. It's like you're getting, it's much more dynamic.
Yeah.
All right, so these are all fantastic resources.
They are.
But for our listeners who are really focused on getting a good score on the IELTS listening test, the source material we've been talking about also had some really great advice.
It did.
So let's get into that.
Okay. The IELTS listening section is tough.
Yeah.
So having a strategy is important.
It is.
First of all, you got to understand the format.
Okay.
The test itself.
Okay, so break down that format for us a little bit.
Sure. So the listening test is divided into 4 parts.
Okay.
It gets harder as you go.
Yeah.
The first part is a conversation between 2 people, like an everyday situation,
Right.
booking something, making an appointment.
Okay.
The second part is a monologue, one person talking on a familiar topic, like a tour guide.
Okay.
The third part is a conversation between 2 to 4 people, maybe like a university setting, a discussion. And then the fourth part is another monologue.
Okay.
But this time it's more academic.
Yeah.
It's like a lecture.
Okay.
Throughout these parts, you'll see all sorts of questions.
Yeah.
Multiple choice, short answer, gap fill, matching.
Yeah, right.
So knowing the format helps you to feel more prepared.
Okay, so knowing what to expect is key.
Yes.
Okay. What else?
Practice.
Practice
with official materials.
Okay.
Those are the only ones that really reflect the real test.
Right.
The types of questions, the recordings, the accents.
All right.
And the good thing is they come with answers and explanations.
Yeah.
So you can see where you went wrong. When you're practicing, try to make it as realistic as possible.
Okay.
Don't pause the recordings.
Right.
Try to stick to the time limits.
Right.
This will help you to concentrate and to process the information quicker.
Okay, so it's about training under realistic conditions.
Yeah, exactly.
What about managing time during the actual test?
Oh, time management is huge.
Okay.
Each recording is played only once.
Okay.
So before each section starts, read those questions.
Okay.
Know what you're listening for.
Okay.
Underline keywords. Figure out what type of answer you need. Then focus on those details.
Okay.
Don't get distracted.
Okay.
Keep an eye on the time, but if you miss something, don't panic.
Okay.
Just move on.
All right. Another skill that seems really important here is note-taking.
Oh, note-taking is vital. You can't write everything down.
Right.
So focus on those key points.
Okay.
The important details.
Okay.
Anything relevant to the questions.
Okay.
Develop your own system, abbreviations, symbols.
Right.
Practice taking notes while you're listening to recordings, podcasts, lectures.
Okay.
Afterwards, look over your notes.
Yeah.
Make sure they make sense.
Okay.
The more you practice, the better you'll get.
All right. So what's the best way to review your performance after you've done a practice test?
If you can, use transcripts, the written versions of the recording.
Okay.
They really help you to see where you made mistakes,
Right.
what you misheard.
Okay.
Pay attention to any words you didn't understand.
Right.
And re-listen to those parts.
Okay. Make a note of any difficult vocabulary or grammar for later.
Right.
The transcript is your way of checking how accurate you are.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Finally, it sounds like incorporating real-life content, beyond just IELTS stuff.
Yeah.
Can be really helpful for the test.
It is.
Yeah.
Try to listen to English media.
Right.
News, podcasts, movies, TV.
Okay.
It helps you get used to accents.
Right.
Vocabulary, natural speaking styles, things like that.
Uh-huh.
TED Talks, YouTube videos, English radio, it's all good. The broader your exposure, the better prepared you'll be.
Okay.
You know, choose something you're interested in.
Right.
That's the right level, you know.
Right.
It makes it more enjoyable.
It does. It does. All right, this